My father's empire began to crumble on a Tuesday morning. I wasn't there to see it, but I was told his voice on the phone crackled with a unique blend of arrogance and rising panic. He was shouting at his wealth manager, a man he usually treated like a servant. "What do you mean an administrative hold? That's my money. Who authorized this?" There was a pause, and the voice on the other end was professionally calm, devoid of the emotion my father was spewing. "Sir, the order is from the U.S. Treasury. It's a non-discretionary compliance freeze." I can just picture the color draining from his face, the sudden, horrifying comprehension dawning in his eyes as he whispered the words that confirmed his worst fear. "Treasury? That's her department." Just 24 hours earlier, I was standing in my wedding dress next to my new husband, David, a quiet engineer who had always seen the person my family refused to. My father, Richard, a man who built his real estate fortune on handshake deals and brute force, took the microphone for his toast. It started with the usual platitudes, but the warmth was a thin veneer over a cold, hard ultimatum. He called my career a boring government desk job with no ambition, a phrase I'd heard 1,000 times before. It was the same tone he used when I won a scholarship he didn't think was prestigious enough, or when I chose my major in college. Then came the wedding gift, a generous trust but with a poison pill attached. It was mine only if I quit my pointless paperwork to become a proper, supportive wife. He said it with a smile, as if offering me a promotion instead of an erasure. I felt David's hand find mine. I walked to the podium and took the microphone from him, my hand steady. "Thank you, Dad. But my career is not pointless, and it's not up for negotiation." The air in the room went still. His folksy charm evaporated, replaced by a mask of pure rage. He leaned in close, his voice a low, venomous hiss, meant only for me to hear. "You ungrateful child, you're gone from this family forever. Don't come back." He dropped the mic with a thud. I didn't cry. I just felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. It was the feeling of a door finally locking after you've been standing in the draft for years. I took David's hand and we walked out of our own wedding, leaving the stunned silence and my father's fury behind us. He thought he was casting me out, severing my connection to the family's wealth and power. He had no idea he'd just given me the professional distance I legally required to do my job. To understand the call I made the next morning, you have to understand the two worlds I had been carefully keeping apart. To the outside world, my family was the picture of success. To me, it was a carefully managed performance with assigned roles. My father was the king, and my older brother Mark was his heir apparent. Mark, the vice president of my father's company, had a charisma that could charm a snake and the moral compass of an alley cat. Our family dinners were his stage. I can still picture him holding a glass of expensive wine, a smug grin on his face, as he recounted his latest triumph, some aggressive, barely legal real estate deal that strong-armed a competitor out of the market. My father would roar with laughter, slapping him on the back and calling him a true shark. They celebrated his ruthlessness as a virtue. In these moments, I was just there, a piece of the furniture. They called me the Librarian, a nickname born from my tendency to be quiet and observant, always with a book or a report nearby. It wasn't a term of endearment, it was a label of dismissal. It meant I was serious, boring, and fundamentally separate from their world of loud victories and flashy profits. Occasionally, I would try to bridge that gap. I'd mention a complex case I was working on, something I was proud of, and my father would wave his hand dismissively before I could even finish the sentence. "Anna, please," he'd say with a long-suffering sigh. "Nobody wants to hear about government bureaucracy. Mark just secured us a new offshore partner. Now that's real business." My world was paperwork. His was power. That was the narrative, and they never let me forget it. My other world, my real world, was an existence they couldn't even begin to comprehend. It was a place of absolute silence and immense weight, housed within the sterile, windowless walls of a sensitive, compartmented information facility, or SCIF. There were no windows, no personal photos, just the low hum of servers and the glow of encrypted data streams. In that silent room, my voice mattered. Here, I wasn't the librarian. I was Senior Investigator Miller. My opinions weren't dismissed, they were sought, analyzed, and acted upon by people who understood the gravity of our work. I remember one particular briefing with my section chief, Director Evans, a stern ex-military man. who communicated in clipped sentences and whose trust you had to earn, ounce by painful ounce. I stood before a massive screen displaying a complex web of financial transactions that looked like a tangled spider's web. The asset transfer to the Shell Corporation in Cyprus matches the pattern used by the Volkov Syndicate, I stated, my voice steady and clear. I pointed to a specific node on the chart. This is their back door. I'm recommending an immediate asset freeze under Executive Order 13773. I laid out the evidence, the procedure, the consequences of inaction. Evans stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. He was silent for a full minute, and then he gave a short, curt nod. Proceed. Good work, Miller. That was it. No backslapping, no toast. Just 3 quiet words. And they meant more to me than every hollow compliment my father ever threw at my brother. It was respect, pure and simple. It was real. The wall I had so carefully constructed between these two worlds began to crack a few weeks before the wedding. In preparing to merge my life with David's, I had to perform my own financial due diligence, which included reviewing the details of a family trust I was still technically a beneficiary of. I wasn't looking for anything. It was just a procedural step to ensure a clean separation. I was scrolling through pages of transactions when my heart suddenly went cold. It was a single, massive investment from my father's company, rooted through an offshore holding company. I recognized the name. It was an entity my team had flagged months ago. It was on a Treasury Department watch list for its deep, undeniable ties to sanctioned oligarchs, the very kind of people I spent my days hunting. I stared at the screen, a sick feeling rising in my stomach. My first thought wasn't anger. It was a desperate hope that this was a colossal, ignorant mistake. My father was aggressive, but surely he wasn't stupid enough to get involved in this. I told myself I would talk to him, help him untangle this mess. I decided to wait until after the wedding, to handle it as his daughter, to give him the benefit of the doubt. I never imagined he would stand up in front of everyone I loved and disown me first. For years, I had accepted their narrative. That I was the quiet, unimportant one. But after he disowned me, my duty was no longer to my family. It was to the oath I swore. The rules he ignored were the very rules I was paid to enforce. The next morning, the sun streamed into the hotel room, painting everything in a soft, hopeful light. It was the first day of my new life. The first day of my honeymoon. David was there. A quiet, solid presence. A silent promise that I wasn't alone. But there was a heavy, unavoidable task I had to perform first. My father's words from the night before echoed in my head. "You're gone from this family forever." I thought he was delivering a punishment, but sitting there in the calm light of morning, I realized he had given me a gift. He had severed the tie, and in doing so, he had dissolved my conflict of interest. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a potential violation of federal law. My decision wasn't born from the ashes of my anger, but from the cold, clear logic of my profession. My goal wasn't to hurt him. My goal was to uphold the oath I had sworn. The consequences would be a product of his own actions, not my emotions. I opened my encrypted government-issued laptop, and the familiar login screen appeared, a portal back into the world where I had control. David sat with me, not speaking, just offering the steady support my own family never had. With methodical precision, I began to work. This wasn't a daughter lashing out. This was an investigator building a case. I pulled the wire transfer records from the family trust, the ones I had flagged weeks ago. I cross-referenced the corporate registration documents for the shadowy offshore entity with our classified Treasury database. Every piece of evidence was documented, time-stamped, and legally unimpeachable. Each click of the keyboard was deliberate, stripping away years of emotional baggage and replacing it with cold, hard facts. My hands didn't shake. My focus was absolute. Then, I made the call. Not to my father, filled with rage and accusations, but to my boss, Director Evans, on a secure line. My voice was level, professional. "Director," I began, "I need to report a conflict of interest and request immediate recusal from a potential investigation." I laid out the facts calmly, explaining that I had discovered evidence that a family trust of which I was a now estranged beneficiary had significant financial exposure to a sanctioned entity. I formally submitted my file through the proper channels. My duty was done. The system would now do the rest. I pressed send and officially recused myself. The machine I had dedicated my life to serving began to turn. They had always underestimated my boring desk job, never understanding that from my desk I could freeze empires. While my father's world was imploding, I was sitting at a small, sun-drenched cafe overlooking the ocean. The air smelled of salt and espresso. David sat across from me, his hand resting over mine, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt a sense of profound, uncomplicated peace. But I knew what was happening thousands of miles away. I couldn't see it, but I could picture it perfectly. I could imagine the oppressive silence of his corporate boardroom, the one with the mahogany table long enough to land a plane on. It was the heart of his empire, the place where he had made and broken men, the stage for his grandest performance. I knew he and my brother Mark were on the verge of their biggest acquisition yet, a deal they saw as the culmination of their life's work, the final jewel in their crown. I also knew the down payment, a wire transfer of several $1,000,000, was due by noon. I imagined Mark, ever the smug heir, clicking the button to send the wire probably, already thinking about the celebratory dinner they'd have that night. Then, a small, red notification. Transfer failed. He would have frowned, annoyed, and tried again. Access denied. A flicker of unease. He'd pull out the corporate American Express, the one with no limit, to call the bank. Declined. The blood would begin to drain from his face. The real panic would have set in when their wealth manager called, his voice tight with an anxiety my father had never heard from him before. He would have directed them to the online portal, where a single stark notification would be waiting. All assets under administrative freeze. Ref, U.S. Treasury. Those 2 words, us, Treasury, would have hit them like a physical blow. This wasn't a bank error they could bully their way out of. This wasn't a competitor they could crush. This was the system. This was my world arriving at their doorstep. Right on cue, my phone began to buzz on the table. The screen lit up with a name I had seen thousands of times, but which now felt like a relic from another life father. I took a deep breath, gave David a small, reassuring nod, and answered. The sound that erupted from the speaker was not a voice, it was pure, undiluted rage. "What did you do?" He screamed, the sound so distorted it was barely human. I held the phone slightly away from my ear and took a calm sip of my coffee before I replied, my voice as even as the horizon over the sea. "I did my job." "Your job?" He shrieked. "You sit at a desk and push paper. You've ruined us." I listened to him rant, a torrent of insults and accusations that, for the first time, had absolutely no effect on me. They were just noise. When he finally paused to take a breath, I spoke again, using the detached, professional tone I used for hostile subjects of investigation. As an officer of the Treasury, I stated clearly, I had a legal and ethical duty to report a potential violation of the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act. My personal feelings are irrelevant. There was a sputtering sound on the other end of the line. He was trying to process it, trying to force this new reality into his old worldview, and it just wouldn't fit. "You're just a clerk." He finally managed to get out, his last pathetic attempt to put me back in the box he had built for me. "You're a nobody." I decided, then and there, to finally show him who I was. "My title is Senior Sanctions Investigator," I said, letting each word land with its full weight. "My team is responsible for tracking and freezing the assets of entities that threaten the national security of the United States. The family trust, which you control, made a transaction with a company on our watch list. I reported it and was recused. The rest is standard procedure." The silence on the other end of the line was more profound than any of his shouting. I could feel his entire perception of me, of his quiet, bookish, unimportant daughter, shattering into a million pieces. He had no response. He had no threats, no insults, no power at all. I had taken him into my world, and in my world he was completely and utterly helpless. I decided to grant him one final professional courtesy. "I suggest you retain counsel specializing in OFAC enforcement," I said softly. "They'll be able to walk you through the next steps." "Goodbye, Richard." I ended the call. David squeezed my hand. The cafe was still quiet, the sun was still warm, and the ocean was still calm. Nothing in my world had changed, but everything in his was gone. He had built his entire world on the idea that money was the ultimate power. He just learned that the people who write the rules for money are more powerful. After hanging up on my father, on Richard, I turned off my phone. The simple act of pressing that button felt more significant than any word I had spoken. A wave of silence washed over me, a quiet so profound it was almost deafening. For the first time, the constant, low-level hum of anxiety that had been the background music to my entire life simply stopped. My honeymoon was no longer just a vacation. It was the beginning of an entirely new existence. David's hand found mine, his touch a silent acknowledgement of the monumental shift that had just occurred. In his quiet support, I found a validation far more powerful than the loud, conditional approval my family had always dangled just out of reach. My secret world, my professional life, was no longer a place I had to hide. It had become my fortress, its walls built of competence and integrity. A year passed in a way I'd never experienced before, with a quiet sense of purpose. I walked into a new, larger office with my name on the door, Task Force Lead. The promotion had come after a long, exhaustive investigation that I was, by law, kept entirely separate from. Director Evans called me in one afternoon to give me the official summary. He spoke in his usual clipped, dispassionate tone, but the details were devastating. The investigation into my father's company had uncovered a web of extensive, willful violations that went far deeper than I had ever suspected. His business, the empire he had built as his legacy, was being systematically dismantled. Its assets were forfeited. He told me my father and my brother Mark were facing a mountain of fines and potential criminal charges. Their legacy, the one they had tried to chain me to, was now a crater of public record and legal ruin. I nodded, thanked him for the update, and felt nothing. Not joy, not satisfaction, just a quiet, final sense of order restored. The system had worked exactly as it was designed to. Justice, I had learned, wasn't emotional. It was procedural. The true measure of my new life came a few months later. David and I hosted a small dinner party in our new home. The house was filled with the easy laughter of friends, colleagues from the department, friends from David's engineering firm, people who saw us simply as Anna and David. The conversation flowed from debates on foreign policy to jokes about a terrible movie we had all seen. It was a symphony of mutual respect and genuine affection. I looked around the table, at these people who valued my intellect and integrity, and a thought struck me with the force of a revelation. This was my family. Not a group bound by blood and obligation, but a community I had chosen, and who had chosen me back. There were no transactions here, no judgments, no one trying to prove they were more important than anyone else. It was just warmth. Then, one rainy afternoon, a final ghost from my old life arrived. It was a single, thick envelope with my mother's familiar handwriting. My mother, Eleanor, a woman who believed the appearance of peace was more important than the reality of it, had finally broken her silence. The letter inside was stained with what I assumed were tears. It was a desperate, rambling plea for me to use my influence, to make it all stop. She wrote about how I had torn the family apart, how my father had made one mistake, how my ambition had destroyed their legacy. She wasn't asking for reconciliation, she was demanding I undo the consequences of their actions. I read the letter twice, and I didn't feel the old sting of anger. I just felt a flicker of a deep, profound sadness. A sadness for the mother she could have been, the one who could have protected her daughter instead of enabling her husband. I realized then that her loyalty was never to her children, only to the fragile, toxic peace my father provided. My peace, the one I had fought so hard for, was not for sale. I walked over to the small shredder in my home office and fed the letter into it. The quiet whir of the machine was the last word in a conversation I had been finished with for a very long time. My father always said my greatest duty was to the family name. I learned my true duty was to the law, and in the end, the law always wins.